Grossman. Chair lays out on second reading House Bill 1888. The clerk will please read the bill.
HB 1888 by Bonin of Galveston, relating to temporary branch polling place hours of operation.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this legislation deals with a practice known as rolling polling. The flexibility of polling locations was designed to accommodate more voters near their homes and their workplaces, but some subdivisions of the state have abused this flexibility, targeting desirable voting populations at the exclusion of others. This practice, known as rolling polling, has resulted in selective vote harvesting. House Bill 1888 confronts this problem by requiring that each polling place during any election be located at a set location for the duration of the early voting period. This will ensure that no polling location may target certain populations over others. Additionally, House Bill 1888 would deter confusion by establishing that polling locations remain at a single accessible place throughout the early voting period. The predictability in polling places following the implementation of this bill would provide reliability and accessibility for all voters.
Following amendment, the clerk will please read the amendment.
Amendment by Busey.
Chair recognizes Mr. Busey to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment permits that for primary and general elections for state and county officers, an early voting clerk may establish temporary early voting locations if they are adopted by the Commissioners Court by January 15th of the election year. This amendment simply will ensure access to early voting for rural voters, for residents of nursing homes, retirement centers, or other long-term care facilities, and for students enrolled in institutes of higher education. This amendment does not give new authority to early voting election clerks in terms of establishing temporary early voting locations, also known as mobile voting. Instead, it seeks to narrowly address a specific problem we heard about when this bill came before the Elections Committee from stakeholders and citizens who came to testify. This amendment does not affect the purpose of the bill. This amendment simply maintains access to early voting for the primary and general elections, especially for our seniors, our rural voters, and our students. And with that, I move adoption.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
Gentleman yield for questions?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman yield, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Busey, you walked through the need for your amendment, but I'd like to understand it a little bit better. Can you explain exactly how your amendment fits into the bill and why it's needed?
So we've heard a lot of these types of bills in the Elections Committee, and one of the concerns is how mobile voting can be used in certain bond election stuff. And we heard a lot of that testimony. This amendment, though, specifically is ensuring that we
can I ask about that testimony? How ubiquitous do you think these abuses are, by the way? Just based on the testimony you heard, is this an isolated case that would cause us to change state law, or do you think it's widespread?
I've heard about it in a couple of instances. In my county, we haven't had any cases of this to my knowledge. And this is why I really bring this amendment, is that our county consistently relies on mobile voting, and we use it for our most rural areas and for our colleges. So it's a way, in our senior citizen homes, so it's a way to really get out to our small counties that average about 300, 400 votes, our small cities, that we can't really maintain a full-time election center, but we'll take it for a day or two, and it's consistent how we do it to make sure those people have easy access to voting.
So why did you choose primary elections and general elections only for this amendment?
I mean, honestly, I was trying to come up with something that I thought the body would see as a compromise to make sure we're ensuring that those without vehicles and other mobility access could still have easy access to the ballot. This amendment only went so far with the attempt of trying to find compromise.
And any fiscal note? Any fiscal impact?
No, there wouldn't be any.
Okay,
this.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I move adoption, unless there's other.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin in opposition to the amendment. John, you were...
Mr. Speaker, I want to say first, I really appreciate Representative Busey. He came to me with this earlier in the day, and we had a really good dialogue about it. And he's been very professional and respectful of the process. I certainly appreciate his perspective. However, I want to be clear that in this legislation, any number of places may be used, any location may be used. The only requirement is that they be consistent throughout the early voting period of the election. And for that purpose, a reason I moved to table this.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak on for or against the amendment? Seeing no one, the chair recognizes Mr. Busey to close on his amendment.
Again, I want to thank Dr. Bonin as well for meeting with me on this issue. I will ask you to vote against tabling. As I said earlier, in Williamson County, just use my own county, we use this as a way to make sure our rural voters and our senior voters and our students, people without mobility access, can get out and vote. If we don't pass this amendment, then it would end up where... If we don't pass this amendment, then it would end up...
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Springer, for what purpose? Gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, sir.
I apologize for not being over here early. Representative was coming back from mine. You know, when you talk about that rule, that you know, the guy who has 22 counties, I can tell you that is absolutely not a problem in our district, that this amendment's not needed to be able to do that. It has been used. We've actually had a challenge where they've tried to move these things around, specifically trying to decide local election type of deals, and I just see this as being a big problem, and it'll be a worse problem in rural Texas.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. I would say, as you highlighted there, local elections, this is limited to primaries and the generals. This amendment would not impact local elections. And as we heard testimony in committee, it was about issues with local elections. That's why I made this amendment with the intention of it to be a compromise tailored to our general and our primaries and does not impact the local elections. As I said earlier, and just using my county as an example, we have some of these small cities which will have 300 total voters. If we don't get this amendment on, our elections office will have to pay to keep that site open for 2 weeks of early voting as opposed to 2 days or 1 day as they do now. And it's been very consistent, and you can go back and look at the records that this is a consistent way that they've done it to make sure these individuals have access to the ballot.
Mr. Speaker, does the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield, Ms. Fier, or Mr. Busey?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman
Representative,
yields.
can you tell me why your amendment specifically brings out or mentions community colleges and nursing homes?
Yeah, just as we're trying to hit rural communities, and if you look at the amendment, it has to be one of those areas. So it's for rural communities, it's for our community colleges where a lot of times kids don't have access to mobility, meaning a car or public transportation access, and it's for our senior citizen homes with the same issue. We're trying to hit the 3 communities where it's harder to get to a place to vote because of lack of transportation, to make sure that they still have the right to vote.
Thank you, Representative.
Absolutely. Well, I ask you to vote no on tabling, as I think this amendment will ensure that we can make sure that individuals can still have access to vote while also not intervening with what I believe to be in the intent of the bill is the local issue, since this bill amendment has nothing to do with local elections. Thank you.
Mr. Busey offers up an amendment. Dr. Bonin has moved to table Mr. Busey's amendment. If you are in support of Mr. Busey's amendment, you would vote no in support of Mr. Busey on the motion to table. If you agree with Dr. Bonin, you would vote aye in tabling the amendment. A record vote has been requested by Mr. Stickland. Record vote is granted. Show Dr. Bonin voting. Clerk, please ring the bell. Show Dr. Bonin voting aye. Show Mr. Busey voting no. Representative Click voting aye. Mr. Turner of Tarrant voting no. Representative Zwinger voting no. Mr. Wilson voting aye. Have all voted. There being 80 ayes and 63 noes, the motion to table prevails. Following amendment, the clerk will please read the amendment.
By Zwiener.
Recognize Representative Zwiener to explain her amendment.
Members, this is a straightforward amendment that makes sure that our counties and other political subdivisions that have experienced a disaster have more flexibility in implementing elections. It exempts them from the terms of this bill so that they have the flexibility they need to deal or to be able to effectively hold an election with facilities that are potentially not entirely operable. I urge you to support this amendment because it allows our counties to hold
Mr. Speaker.
elections despite
Mr. Moody,
any
for what
issues.
purpose?
Will the lady yield for a couple questions?
Does lady yield for a question?
I do.
Lady yields, Mr. Moody.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your amendment deals with declared disaster. What situations are we talking about? Or do we define that in the amendment?
Yes, it is an area that has experienced a declared disaster as declared by either the governor or the president of the United States. So it's actually quite a high bar.
Okay, so what's for the body? I mean, what instances are we grabbing with that language? What are we getting after?
Hurricanes, severe tornadoes, severe flooding, severe wildfire.
So are there any instances in the area that you represent that would have qualified for this exemption if it were the law going back then?
Yeah, I mean, potentially the Halloween floods in Wimberley and the rest of Hayes County in 2015 could have triggered this language. It actually could have triggered it for Travis County as well because they were impacted by that flooding too.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you bringing it.
Yeah, thank you. Members, I move adoption.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to thank Representative Zwiener for coming to me earlier and having a really good discussion about this. So again, to be clear, and my community has lived through natural disaster, so we know what that experience is like. But this bill does not preclude any location from being used. It doesn't preclude any number, more or less, of locations being used. It simply says choose your location and use it throughout the early voting period. I think that that's something that is quite manageable, and I move to table.
Dr. Bonin's moved to table the amendment. Chair recognizes Representative Zwinger to close.
Members, I want to thank Dr. Bonin as well for working with me on this amendment despite the fact that we do disagree. Of course, there's nothing in his bill that precludes a location for being open that full 2 weeks. However, there's also no ability for a county or other jurisdiction holding an election to compel a location to be open for a full 2 weeks. So the situations I'm concerned about are ones where government buildings are damaged and the only facilities available for the full early voting period are private facilities that may not be willing to be open during that time. So members, I hope that you will vote against the motion to table this amendment and vote in support of members of our communities being able to vote after a disaster that has damaged traditional polling locations.
Representative Zwiener has offered up an amendment. Dr. Bonin moved to table. Mr. Stickland has requested a record vote. Therefore, there will be a record vote. Dr. Bonin moved to table, so you would be voting with Dr. Bonin as aye, and you would be voting with Representative Zwiener as a no against the motion to table. Record vote. The clerk will please ring the bell. Show Dr. Bonin voting aye. Show Representative Zwiener voting no. Show Representative Turner of Tarrant voting no. Show Representative Click voting aye. There being 81 ayes and 64 nays, the amendment is tabled. Following amendment, the clerk will please read the amendment.
Amendment by Zwiener.
Chair recognizes Representative Zwiener to explain her amendment.
Members, this is an amendment I'm bringing because of the way my district uses temporary polling locations. We use temporary polling locations because they are areas where we have population centers, but we do not have government buildings that are consistently available for the full 2-week early voting period. Instead, the community utilizes churches in particular, churches that are not willing to give their space up for full 2 weeks, but are able to be open for 3 or 4 days. So what my amendment does is it exempts a location from this requirement if that location is at least 5 miles away from the closest public building. So I want to say that I wish every single voting location could be open a full 2 weeks, but I think we have to recognize some of the practical barriers to that, including community centers or centers of population that do not have county buildings that the county can compel to be open for that full time.
Will the gentlelady yield for a question?
Does the lady yield for a question?
I yield.
Lady yields, Mr. Busey.
Representative, can you give us a few examples from your district where this would come into play?
Yeah, one example is the entire area of my district that's east of I-35. In particular, the city of Kyle has struggled to find early voting locations east of the interstate, and the one they finally found is a church called Icon Church that has graciously opened its doors to the community, but they don't want to have voting there for full 2 weeks. It's disruptive to their services. Another example is east of Dripping Springs. It's an area where everyone in that area commutes into Austin, but the closest county voting location is west of there. They would have to drive 45 minutes to an hour out of their way to vote. Instead, a local community center owned by a neighborhood has been gracious enough to open, again, for 3 days during the early voting period.
So are these rural areas or suburban areas without just...
These are suburban areas, though there is actually, in my small towns, Blanco County ends up opening just for 2 days in the city of Blanco over the weekend because it's not practical.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
For the full 2 weeks. Thank you. I move adoption.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to be clear, there's no requirement in this bill that a polling location be a public location. It may be any location. The only requirement is that it be available to the voters throughout the early voting period. And I move to table.
Chair recognizes Representative Wiener to close.
Members, I respectfully ask you to vote against the motion to table. Again, while I really admire the aims of this bill to ensure that every early voting location is open the full 2 weeks, unfortunately in some communities that just isn't practical because the lack of government-owned buildings that the county can compel to be open and available for the full period. So with that, I really respectfully ask you to oppose this motion to table.
Representative Wiener has offered up a minute. Dr. Bonin moved to table. Mr. Stickland has requested a record vote. The record vote is granted. In voting in support of Representative Wiener, you would vote no on the motion to table, and voting with Dr. Bonin, you would vote aye for the motion to table. The clerk will please ring the bells. Show Representative Wiener voting no, Dr. Bonin voting aye, Mr. Kane voting aye, Mr. Turner of Tarrant voting no, Mrs. Click voting aye. There being 81 ayes and 64 nays, the motion to table prevails. Following amendment, the clerk will please read the amendment.
Amendment by Turner of Tarrant.
Chair recognizes Mr. Turner of Tarrant to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment would remove all institutions of higher education from this bill. And let me tell you the reason why I'm bringing this amendment. In Tarrant County that I represent, our Tarrant County Elections Department does a very good job of running the early voting process. And part of what they do is they do have temporary locations at different college campuses around the county. Now, it's not practical to have a early vote location for the entire 2 weeks of early voting at every single college campus, but what is practical is to rotate temporary locations 2 to 3 days at a time throughout our colleges and community colleges. For instance, last year, October 23rd through 25th, which was Tuesday through Thursday, they had early voting available at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Texas Wesleyan University, and University of North Texas Health Science Center. Then, on the 30th and 31st, they had early voting available at 3 Tarrant County College campuses, the Northeast Campus and Representative Stickland's district, the Northwest Campus, and the South Campus. On October 29th and 31st, then they had early voting at the University of Texas at Arlington, where about 44,000 students attend on campus, and at Texas Christian University. And I gave you those examples. For those of you familiar with Tarrant County, that is all over the county geographically. This is not geographically centered in one part of the county. So everybody in the county is getting access to these temporary locations.
Mr. Speaker.
Mrs. Hinojosa, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Sure, I'll be happy to
Gentleman
yield.
yields.
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No, that's okay.
Chairman Turner, but I'm curious as to why college campuses, in your view, because of your amendment, are of particular concern when it comes to Texans voting.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the question. I think they're a particular concern. I think they should be treated differently in this bill because college students are different. College students oftentimes live on campus or right near campus. They may not own a vehicle or have access to a vehicle because they walk everywhere or ride a bike. So there is a convenience factor to make voting accessible to college students. And when you're a student, you're on class, you're on campus at class throughout the course of the day. You may not be practical to get off campus and get to an early voting site, down at the grocery store 5 miles away before they close at 5 p.m. or 7 p.m., whichever time it closes. So offering that convenience so all college students have the ability to vote if they choose to exercise their right, I think is an important thing to do. And I think increasing opportunities for young people to participate in the electoral process is never a bad thing.
One of the things that I experienced, and I'm not sure if you've experienced this in your district too, but at UT here in the district I represent, college students not being able to wait all that long in a line because they'd have to catch a class. And so witnessing college students leaving a polling place and hoping to come back later when it's more convenient because they just can't simply wait in line. Is that your experience?
Well, no, that's exactly right, and we see that at the, those of us running for office like to see long lines. We like it when people are voting, but obviously we know lines can be a deterrent to some people participating in the election. And at permanent early voting locations, the ones that are there year after year, voters do get used to going to those, and they become sort of the go-to places. And those are the places that tend to attract long lines. And yeah, that can be a deterrent to anyone, but particularly a college student that may have trouble getting there and may be limited on time. Whereas these temporary locations, you don't have a lot of non-college student voters coming to those locations, right? Those are there just for the people on that campus, maybe the employees that work on that campus.
And were you aware that young people aged 18 to 24, their voter turnout is not quite maybe what our generation's turnout is now or was at that time? Well, did you know that?
Well, that's right. The data show that the younger Americans, including here in Texas, do not participate in elections at the same rate as older Americans do.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's a shame because the millennial generation is a huge demographic numerically. We need them to be engaged in the political process for the future of our country, the future of our state, because they're going to be running this place before too much longer, and we need them engaged in the political process.
And in fact, within the recent election, there was a lot of controversy at Prairie View A&M over early polling places, and they had to decide whether they're going to have people voting, and in fact, it has been an issue. As a result, I filed a bill to try to get access to more polling places for students, and not successful this session, but I know there have been some issues. I'm sorry I misspoke because I said our generation, and I was actually comparing our current millennials to baby boomers, and I know you and I aren't quite the baby boomer generation.
Not quite. You're definitely not. I'm not quite in that generation.
I think we're about the same, but 18, 24-year-olds. Did you know that baby boomers turnout was 26%? And the recent Pew study that I see says millennials at that age only turn out at 20%.
Yeah, it is substantially lower in compared to, certainly to baby boomers, but even Generation X, our generation, I guess, it is substantially lower. And part of that is access. And we know millennials are much less likely to own a car than we were when we were, 20, 22 years old. They don't want to own a car for whatever reason. So transportation becomes an issue. The cost of housing, particularly on or around a college campus, is expensive. So a lot of times they're very much confined to where they can walk to or ride a bike to. why would we not make an early voting place available to them for 2 or 3 days at a time during a major election?
Thank you. You have a great amendment, Chairman Turner.
Thank you, Representative Hinojosa. I move adoption.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, respectfully, I encourage college students to vote. And in this bill, the territory that's having the election can put a voting machine on every campus, and they can leave it there for the entire early voting period. If you allow this to become temporary and move them around, how do you decide who benefits from that? People work, they have children, everybody has obligations, everybody has things in their life that make it difficult for them to stop what they're doing, but voting is critically important. It's just as important for those who are employed or taking care of their children as it is for students. And again, this doesn't prevent anybody from having a voting machine on the campus. It just requires that it be there throughout the voting period. And I motion to table.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is about providing college students access to the ballot box. That's what this is about. And I understand what Dr. Bonin is saying, that we shouldn't allow certain people to be able to have access to this that others don't. But as I went through in my example of Tarrant County, the temporary early vote sites in Tarrant County are in all geographic areas of the county. They're in urban areas and they're in suburban areas. They're in Democratic areas, they're in Republican areas. They're in heavily minority areas, they're in heavily Anglo areas. They make it available to everyone, because the point is everyone should have the right to vote.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Bonin, for what purpose?
Will Chairman Turner yield for a question?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, I'll yield.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Chairman Turner. I appreciate your concern. Now, would you agree with me that if a campus was chosen as an early voting location and it was maintained as an early voting location all day throughout the early voting period, that would actually provide greater access for those students to vote?
Undoubtedly. I do agree with that, and I would love it if on all of the college campuses that I listed a few minutes ago, which was a total of 8, that they had early voting sites for the entire 12 days of the early voting period. However, and we asked the county about this, in the November 2018 election, just a few months ago, the temporary sites for 2 or 3 days would cost an average of $4,800 to operate those sites. A permanent site for the entire 12 days of early voting costs an average of $14,500. So if you do the math, that's basically an extra $77,000 it would cost Tarrant County to be able to run permanent early vote sites at all 8 of those colleges and universities. So again, I think that giving counties the flexibility where there is a demonstrated need to provide early voting accessibility is an efficient way to do it. It helps them save taxpayer resources while providing additional opportunities for qualified voters to participate in the election. And, I think if we saw that, oh my gosh, Tarrant County is only having early voting available at, community college in this part of town, but it excluded a community college on the other side of the county, yeah, that would be a problem. But that's not what they do. They make it available everywhere to everyone. UT Arlington, TCU. The demographics of those student bodies, very different. I haven't analyzed the election results, but I would imagine that their voting preferences are pretty different as well. But they make it available to both because both should have the opportunity to vote in an election. And why we would take that opportunity away, why we would make it more expensive for our county, in other words, more expensive for the taxpayers that we represent, I'm not sure. So all I'm asking is that we vote no on this motion to table to preserve the ability for a county elections office to provide temporary polling locations during early voting at a college or university. And I ask you vote no on the motion to table.
Mr. Turner of Tarrant offers up an amendment. Dr. Bonin moves to table. Mr. Stickland requests a record vote. Clerk will please ring the bell. Show Dr. Bonin voting aye for the motion to table. Show Mr. Turner of Tarrant voting no against the motion to table. Show Representative Middleton voting aye. There being 81 ayes and 64 nays, motion to table prevails. Is there anyone else here wishing to speak on, for, or against the bill? Is there anyone else here wishing to speak on, for, or against the bill? To recognize Representative Israel to speak against the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for allowing me this time to speak. Members, I serve on the Elections Committee, and I'm operating without notes here, but my heart is telling me that this is, you know what this is. This bill is voter suppression. And it's going against the grain of what mobile voting is intended to be. Mobile voting is intended to be flexible. Mobile voting means that the Asian market in my district doesn't need to have a full day early voting there every day of the week. It means the Senior Citizen Center in Manor, Texas, that only has programming on Tuesdays and Thursdays, doesn't need a mobile voting site there every day of the week. What's the problem that we're trying to fix here? If there is a problem with some locals, and we heard in committee with some school districts, then take it up with the school district. Why are we bringing in the big bad state to tell Hayes County and Grimes County and Smith County that we know better how your voters move and operate? We know where your voters shop. We know where your senior citizens go. We know where your state employees are. When it's election time, there is at least one mobile voting site here in the Capitol complex for a lot of my constituents who are state employees for whom it is convenient. I would love to see the day when the state of Texas is actually working to make it easier for our citizens to make their voice heard, instead of doing what we're doing today, which is squeezing the life out of them. And yes, it upsets me. Someday we're going to get this right. Today is not the day if you're going to vote for this bill. I will leave it there so that my emotions do not get the best of me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Dr. Bonin to close.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Rosenthal.
Does the gentleman yield for questions?
Well, he hadn't begun, but
Thank
sure.
you, thank you, Dr. Bonin. I appreciate you taking the time to answer a couple of questions. We both have the distinct honor and privilege of representing a constituency on this House floor. Is that right?
Yes.
And so, would you agree that we're both huge proponents of representative democracy, yeah?
Yes.
Perfect. So since we're aligned on that, I want to ask you about the provision in this bill that allows polling places for early voting in a county of less than 1,000 to be open for a period of 3 hours, like they can reduce their voting time to a 3-hour period. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, so it's not a county and it's not a population. It's 1,000 or it's under 1,000 registered voters, and it's any territory that's administering an election in which they have fewer than 1,000 registered voters. It doesn't allow them to have a change in the venue or locations, but it does allow them to have fewer hours. It could be 3 hours instead of 8.
Very good. I appreciate the answer. Thank you. And so I'm struggling with this time period. How did you come up with this 3 hours for this?
That was a concession to territories that have a relatively small number of registered voters, so that they were not required to maintain those locations for 8 hours throughout every day of early voting. It's still the same locations throughout early voting. It's still each day of early voting. But if you have fewer than 1,000 registered voters, it's discretionary. It's not a requirement. So they may still keep them open for 8 hours. But if they choose, they could shorten that to 3 hours each day.
So I understand that, and thank you for your answer. Isn't it true that most people who work for a living work periods well in excess of 3 hours?
Certainly.
So doesn't this preclude the consideration that there are going to be some people who will not be able to get to the polls during a 3-hour period? That seems amazingly
So the answer to that is that right now they actually would not have to be open every day. They could move the location around during early voting, and that would actually make it more likely that they were not able to vote. This is an improvement over the status quo, even for those territories with fewer than 1,000 voters.
It's hard for me to see how allowing a polling location to limit its open hours to 3 is an improvement over anything. So are you saying right now they're allowed to be open for that short amount of time?
So what I'm saying right now is that the early voting locations may change throughout the 2-week early voting period. So there's not consistency, there's not predictability, and no, they may not be open the entire 8 hours.
There's not predictability, so they don't have to file and post the voting locations
so the
and the
purpose
schedule
of
ahead
this
of
bill
time
is,
and all of
is
that?
to make it clear that we have the same locations throughout the early voting period and that those locations are open, and the only exception is if there are fewer than 1,000 registered voters in that territory, they still must have the same locations throughout the early voting period, but they may shorten the hours at their discretion to 3 hours.
It strikes me as extremely dangerous. I'm sorry to say it like that, but to shorten to 3 hours, most of the jobs that I've worked provide for a break at least once every 4 hours for at least 30 minutes. I think that's the law of the land. And so what this means is there would be a possibility that some voters could be locked out.
Actually, what it means is that now, because that location has to be open every day, they actually have a greater opportunity to vote.
So if the place is required to be open every day and they choose to be open between 8 and 11 and I have to work from 7 to 12 before I get my first break, does that mean I will not have any opportunity to vote during the early voting period?
Yeah, I think that I can only recite for you what's in the bill so many times.
I think okay, I'm not going to take any more of your time. I appreciate you being patient with me.
Yeah, and
I would urge to specify a minimum of 8 hours. That's the day that everyone works. And
well, so it's actually been pointed out that you're required by federal law to have at least an hour away from work to go and vote.
It is, but they don't. Does it specify when? I mean, even though that's specified and that's true, and I appreciate that, that's very good, but it's still, these are rural areas that we're talking about.
Yeah, and so respectfully, again, to speak to your concern, we're actually creating more hours that would be available than what would likely be available under current law.
Under current law, are they allowed to limit the period that they're open to 3 hours
they can
in
limit
any
the
location
days,
at
and
any
they
place
can
at
move
any
the
time?
locations.
I'm sorry, what?
They can move the locations.
Right, no, so my direct question was, under current law, are they allowed to limit their open hours to just 3 on any particular day?
Yes.
Under current law, they are right now.
I believe that's correct.
Okay, well, that answers my question. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bonin. I'm trying to understand the construction of the bill really quickly. So in sections 1 and 2 of the bill, you are amending section 42.0621A of the election code, right? And those, sorry about that. I'll let you get your folder. And so there you are limiting the uniform election dates to just the November date. Is that correct? And what are you limiting those? What exactly are you limiting just to those November election dates?
So I'm not a ledge council drafter, so I'm not prepared to speak to the drafting of the legislation. The intent of the bill is to say during any election that is held, whether it's a bond election, whether it's a general election, whether it's a primary election, during the 2 weeks of early voting, any number of locations may be chosen. Those locations may be at the discretion of the territory, but they must be held constant, and they must remain open for 8 hours,
right,
unless there are fewer than 1,000 registered voters, in which case they may choose to limit the hours to 3 hours.
So I get the hours. Like I see where in sections 3 and 4 and 5 you're discussing the hours of operations, but what I'm trying to understand is in section 1 and 2, the subject of those is to limit something to November.
Well,
and what is the something that we're limiting to November?
Yeah, and again, understanding that I'm not a ledge council attorney drafting this bill, we are actually amending existing statute, and I think that without putting all of it together, it can be difficult to read these words and then interpret it.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is why not
statute.
May elections, and why have you limited in sections 1 and 2 to November?
Yeah,
because I think that's a different subject that is unrelated to the polling hours.
I don't think we're limiting it to November elections.
Okay. But in sections 1 and 2, it specifically says held on November uniform election date, held on November uniform election date, as opposed to May, and I'm trying to understand what that limitation is.
Well, again,
because I think that's a different subject
I
than
think it's part of
relating
the broader,
to the polling
I think it's part of the broader
place.
context of the existing statute.
Okay. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
I rise to raise a point of order on House Bill 1888 under Rule 8, Section 1 and 3.
Please bring your point of order down front.
Thank you.
Members, Representative Anchia has withdrawn the point of order. The chair recognizes Dr. Bonin.
Move passage.
Question occurs on the passage to engrossment to House Bill 1888. As a record vote has been requested by Representative Stickland, a record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Shall Representative Click voting aye, Dr. Bonin voting aye, Representative Harless voting aye, Representative Click voting aye, Representative Perez voting nay. Shall Representative Patterson voting aye. Have all voted, so Representative Allison voting aye. Have all voted. Having 77 ayes and 64 nays, House Bill 1888 is passed to engrossment. Representative
Speaker.
Rosenthal, for what purpose?
May I respectfully request that the debate on this last bill be reduced to writing and entered in the journal?
You may do so. Is there any objection? Chair hears none. The motion is adopted.